Hi and welcome to DevOpsCon. Thank you for being here, Mr. Sussna.
My pleasure.
So my first question would be, what happens when we apply design to IT?
So traditionally, IT has been really focused on making and running things. Data centers and databases and networks and applications and things like that. So it's been really behind the scenes. But now we live in a world where every business is becoming a digital business, and IT is becoming really central to how companies run their entire business and even how they interact with their customers. So when I use a bank, I do most of my banking over the web. So my relationship with my bank is entirely based on their IT systems. And so that brings a whole new pressure and a whole new set of concerns that we have to stop just thinking about IT as running systems, and now we have to think about it in terms of providing services, both to other parts of the organization and to the company's customers. And we have to design those services like we design everything else. We need to take a really user-centered approach to how are we making our systems and what is it that they make possible and how do people use them. And the really interesting thing from my perspective is we're not just talking about user interface design, but we have to take this approach to service really all the way down through the IT organization. We talk a lot these days about microservices, and they really are services. And they're not just little pieces of separate functionality, but they provide service to each other, and it's only when all of those pieces work together that the whole thing comes together. And in fact, you could even think of DevOps as developers and operations people thinking about each other as customers and thinking about the relationships with each other and how to provide service to each other in new ways.
And you said that a service is basically a promise, right?
Yes.
And sometimes promises, of course, get broken. So how can companies make sure that they, first of all, they make the right promise, and second, they get to keep it?
So when you're providing service, you're making a set of promises of benefit that you're going to provide your customer. So Amazon, for example, promises to help you get everything you need in your life, from shaving cream to snow tires to books, as quickly and cheaply and easily as possible. And they make a whole set of other promises in order to help you do that. So if you have an important meeting this week and you're out of shaving cream and you give Amazon an extra $5, they promise that your shaving cream will show up on Tuesday instead of Thursday. And the thing about promises, it may seem like a bit of an odd word. On the one hand, it's very intuitive. We all know what a promise is, and we all make promises to each other every day. But we may wonder, why are we using this word? Why aren't we talking about service in terms of things like contracts or guarantees? Well, first of all, a promise is something that you voluntarily make. It's something you sign up for. And so it's something that comes from the inside out and the bottom up, as opposed to requirements that just kind of rain down from on high and we feel like we're obligated to do them. So they create this attractive force that helps all of the parts of the organization benefit each other and by extension benefit the customer. The other thing about the word promise is that, as you said, sometimes we break our promises. And this may sound bad, but it's actually very good because it forces us to think about the possibility of failure, and as a result, it gives us a better chance of success. I had an experience recently where I was trying to get paid by a European client, and they had to send me an international wire transfer, and my bank wasn't really set up for it, and so it wasn't working. And it went around in circles several times, and I started to get frustrated because I wasn't getting paid, and my client within this company was getting frustrated and embarrassed too, to the point where he sent this very scathing email to his own AP department that he CC'd me on. And he said, why can't we take the lead to solve these problems so that our vendor, who was kind enough to come to Europe and help us, can get paid for his time? And the problem was that the AP department wasn't set up to think about, what do we do if something goes wrong? How do we make sure that we keep our promise even if something goes wrong? And you could even say that they were making the wrong promise. What they were promising was, we'll enter the data in the system and we'll tell you what happened, whether it succeeded or failed. They weren't promising to actually make sure that I got paid. So when you take this approach as a service provider of committing to provide some kind of benefit, and also thinking about, well, what are we going to do if something goes wrong and we can't keep our promise? Or what are we going to do if we find out that it's actually the wrong promise to make in the first place? Then you have this ability to continually adapt to the market and continually adapt to failure, which is something we always encounter in IT systems, and provide customer quality regardless.
So would you say that the shape of a company and of an organization influences the shape of the product or the service or the application?
I would, and specifically I would because someone named Melvin Conway said that it would. A long time ago in 1968, he wrote an article called How Do Committees Invent? And at the time he was a software engineer and manager, and he was trying to understand how do you design good systems and how do you design systems well. And he understood something about the nature of system design of any kind of system, which is if it's sufficiently large, you have to break it down into pieces. You know, your website has a home page, it has a search engine, it has a review mechanism, it has a shopping cart. And once you do that, you then have to figure out how do all of the pieces communicate with each other so that what you end up with is a website and not just a bunch of disembodied pieces. And then he observed that the process of designing those systems is the same. You can't design something big with just one person or just one team. You have to break it down. So you figure out the search engine, I'll figure out the shopping cart, and then you have the same problem, which is how do these design teams communicate with each other so that what you end up with is one organization building one thing. The really powerful thing about Conway was he made the observation that the shape of your organization, the way that people communicate with each other, actually drives the shape of what you end up with. And I had an experience of my own early in my career that I think is a perfect illustration of this. There was a team of 4 guys and they were building a big sophisticated application, and they had a bit of a rivalry among themselves. So they basically said, okay, you go figure out your piece and I don't care about it, and I'm going to figure out my piece and I'm not going to tell you about it. And as a result, what they did was they each ended up duplicating a certain piece of work that should have been common across the application. So instead of having one piece in the center, there were 4 pieces, which was a perfect representation of how these 4 guys communicated or didn't communicate with each other. And so companies now are starting to learn how to actually use this to their advantage. Because if you think about it, according to Conway's observation, or what we call Conway's Law, if you want to end up with a certain kind of design, if you make your organization look that way, you're guaranteed to end up with it. So this is why people are figuring out that, for example, if we want to break our applications into little pieces called microservices so they can all move much more quickly, we also have to break our organization into little microservice teams so that the two match each other.
So we know that designing is very important. How about redesigning?
Well, it's interesting because the DevOps community really kind of took hold of Conway's Law. And you pretty much can't go to a DevOps conference these days without hearing his name. But Conway's Law actually isn't the whole article. In about the last half page or so, he makes this really provocative comment where he basically starts by saying there's no such thing as a perfect design. And I know in my own career, I can't count the number of times I've gone back and looked at something I did a year ago and thought, oh, that was a really dumb way to do that. If I knew then what I knew now, I would have done this really differently. And it's also the case that no matter how much you iterate and no matter how much user testing you do, you can't actually perfectly predict how people are going to use your designs until they do it. And you think you're solving problem X, and then you discover it's really X plus Y or maybe X minus Y. And even beyond that, simply by using something, people are changed, which means the design problem is changed. So social media has really profoundly changed who we are, and in the process it's changed what we expect from social media. If you look at the kinds of problems that companies like Facebook and Twitter face now, they're different from the problems they faced when they started 5 or 10 years ago or however many. And there's no way they could have predicted them because they didn't exist yet. So you could say that as important as the ability to design is the ability to redesign. But we have a problem, which is that Conway's Law tells us that on some level we are doomed to forever stamp out the same designs over and over again based on our organizational structure. And that's why Conway makes this statement at the very end of his article, which I think is worthy of really deep and careful contemplation, when he says flexibility of organization is important to effective design. So not only do we need to think about how our organizations drive what we make, we have to think about how to have the ability to actually change and adapt our organizations in order to change and adapt the things we make.
So basically, DevOps is a real buzzword nowadays. You said yesterday in the panel that DevOps should be a virus, right? And it should affect more people. Mm-hmm. So could you maybe comment on that?
Sure. So I think when we talk about things like adapting the organization and applying design to IT, I think DevOps is actually a really good example of doing that. Because it started from thinking about, well, there's a problem in the way we're trying to do things and the ways we're trying to communicate with people or between people. How can we create better results by changing that? And the solution that the DevOps community came up with is to take much more of a systems thinking approach and much more of an integrated approach to how different parts of the organization work together. And what we find when we look beyond DevOps is other parts of the organization have the same problems for the same reasons. If we're going to provide digital service to customers, we somehow need our entire company to be focused around working together to provide that service, which is very different. You know, traditionally we've been focused more on, well, how do we make this part as efficient and cost effective? And how do we make that part as efficient and cost effective? And we do it by separating them. And now we have to figure out how to put them back together. You know, I encounter designers who are having exactly the same problems in working with human process implementation teams that developers and operations people are having. It could be a DevOps talk, it's just different words. So when I say I think that DevOps should be a virus, I think on one hand, we have to think bigger than ourselves and not get too focused on, well, we've solved DevOps, so we've solved the whole problem. On the other hand, I think we have a really good example here of how to move forward. And what I mean by virus is the idea of actually moving that example through other parts of the organization and connecting with them and showing them how they can solve the same problem we have in a similar fashion.
Thank you very much for the interview and enjoy your days in Berlin.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. It's great to be back in Germany, and thank you.